So I wrote in my journal the other day, what good is manhood? And then I proposed that question to my girlfriend this morning. And she started saying things like, well, you can walk down the street without getting harassed. You often get better pay. And I was like, no. Like, what's good about manhood that I would want, like, to pass on to the next generation? As opposed to like womanhood. Arguably many things good about womanhood and ethics of care. So then she said there's a sense of like responsibility to family, and there's a sense of good competition, which I would describe as like the anime ideal of like two characters pitted against each other, but in a friendly way so as to like constantly make one another better.
You've always been stronger, Kachan. I know that you're better than me. That's why I want to beat you, because you're amazing!
Another great example of that is in Power Rangers. But it seems like manhood ends up becoming this situation where competition becomes an end in itself, and the part about family essentially becomes patriarchy. And we have this idea of patriarchy. You have this idea of patriarchy within your head right now. But if we take it back to the root of the word, it's essentially saying rule of the father, which I don't think is a super controversial thing to say, that for most of recent human history, that's been the status quo, is the head male of the family is the essentially ruler of the family. And then this obviously percolates into other aspects of social life, such as politics and government and business and science and just basically everything. Men are established as the top authority. So it's tempting to want to say, well, let's just collapse manhood and womanhood into personhood. Like, why do we need to have a separation between manhood and womanhood? And the problem with that, even in the way that I've written it here, which I didn't do intentionally, but I've put manhood on top of womanhood. I think that when you collapse two distinct qualities or attributes of a way of life into one, likelihood is that one's going to overtake the other. And in this sense, the manhood aspect of that will overtake womanhood in the collapse into personhood. It's the same problem with all humans are the same race. I don't see color. All humans are the same race. It's that same problem of removing the uniqueness that comes from different attributes of humanity. So then I was like, well, okay, why don't we just take out manhood entirely and we just have like this womanhood aspect of humanity and this personhood aspect of humanity? Obviously, this is problematic as well, because while manhood may have many problems with it, I don't think that we need to erase manhood. I think we need to rethink it, redefine it. And part of what we're trying to redefine is the prevalent toxic aspects of manhood that we see in our modern day. And this isn't to say that other aspects of humanity, other aspects of being as a human, i.e. womanhood, are not toxic or not problematic. I think TERFism as a kind of ideology is something that extends out of womanhood and is a toxic aspect of womanhood. All right, so redefining manhood. How can we do this? So again, I wanted to talk about the primary two aspects that I mentioned up front. And this isn't to say that these are the only two aspects, but just the ones most front of mind for me. The first is competition as a means to self-expression, not competition as an end in itself. And what I mean here is that competition in our culture today, especially American culture, is seen as a necessary good, and that there should always be competition happening in order to produce the best results. In that sense, competition becomes the end in itself. We could see this in capitalism and the libertarian ideology. Basically, that without competition, you can't produce good. Good being new ideas, useful ideas. Taking that aspect of competition as an end in itself and instead saying, how can we use competition as a means towards self-expression? It kind of goes back to the way in which anime idealizes power and the building up of one's potential, especially when it comes to like a competition between two characters, and how they tend to better themselves through competition with one another. Another example of this that I can think of is CJVX, who, in the sense that YouTube is a competition, you're competing for views and attention on YouTube. CJVX is using that aspect of YouTube to develop his online persona and spread his ideas.
Post on Instagram advertising my first ever solo live show, and the comments on it annoyed me. Social media is extremely good at making you feel annoyed and unresolved because this incentivizes you to then engage more, use the app, comment. It makes you feel discomfort that you need to resolve, and you think you can resolve it by using the app more. But the more you use the app, the more you steep yourself into misunderstanding, and so you just keep crawling back to it. It's slot machine logic. Say it with me. Slot machine logic.
And I think he does that in a well articulated and also in a artistic way. Going back to the last slide where my girlfriend was talking about what are the good aspects of manhood, she had mentioned the part about responsibility to family. And we see how that responsibility to family, just like competition, when it becomes an end in itself, is harmful. So what I thought of when I was redefining manhood here is the Spider-Man versus Batman approach to superheroism. And obviously Spider-Man's most famous quote is,
"With great power comes great."
Spider-Man definitely identifies himself as a New Yorker, as part of the community. Whereas Batman sees himself as separate from Gotham.
I'll be standing where I belong, between you and the people of Gotham.
In a way that he's like their protector. And I think this is kind of a middle step towards authoritarianism and fascism that Batman often gets associated with.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Now, another interesting aspect of redefining manhood, especially when comparing it to womanhood, manhood often gets associated with transcendence. Transcendence being the aspects of humanness where we seek to change and become more or better than what we are now. Contrasting that with immanence, which are the attributes of humanity associated with a being there in the moment, so like an ethics of care. And obviously, in broad strokes, this gets associated with womanhood. I think if we take manhood and womanhood as a binary spectrum, then we're missing so many points about what it is not only to quote unquote be a man or what manhood is, but also what womanhood is and what these other aspects of humanness are. Instead of thinking of a spectrum, we should think of a nodes and a very complicated web-like network. And this network includes things such as queerness, youthfulness, blackness. You could even talk about Southern hospitality-ness, academicness, activistness, wisdom. And obviously these are a very limited number of aspects of what it is to be human, or different attributes that you can take on as a human. In this node-like perspective, we get a better understanding of all the connections between these different traits and attributes. So instead of manhood being simply the opposite of womanhood or diametrically opposed to womanhood, manhood is distinct from womanhood in certain ways, but it's also distinct and informed by youthfulness. And in this sense, I would maybe point to my father and myself and how a lot of the fun, adventurous things in life were informed by my relationship with my dad in a large way. And that's not to say that manhood is all about adventure, but by connecting these nodes to one another, by connecting these attributes to one another, we're uncovering aspects of manhood that wouldn't be there if we simply had a spectrum between manhood and womanhood. And the same can exist between manhood and Black culture. And there's a certain way that Black culture informs manhood.
My pop said Wakanda was the most beautiful thing you ever seen. He promised he was gonna show it to me one day. You believe that? Kid from Oakland running around believing in fairy tales.
So it's kind of a two-way street in that all these connections are at once, if you take a particular attribute, informing how that attribute connects, but it's also, if you consider the attribute that it's connecting to, informing that attribute as well. So we were talking about superheroes and I brought up Spider-Man and Batman. And then I think the thing about this slide that some of you may have noticed is that, wow, you've set up a spectrum here between immanence and transcendence and how womanhood is this and manhood is this. Well, after having viewed that complex web of things, we can take ideas like competition and power and apply them to a character like Wonder Woman. In the movie Wonder Woman, we see a society of only women who are competing with one another to better themselves, who have great power and who have established a culture around powerful, not necessarily around, well, okay, so, and this is the tricky part about power that is more than what I want to talk about here right now. But what I wanted to say was that they've built this culture around power, and that's partly true. I think if you do look at their culture, they have like a leader who's the ultimate authority. And so in that sense, they're not like a non-hierarchical society, which again, we're getting into more than what I want to talk about today. Regardless, we see how in the character and world of Wonder Woman, just as much as we would think of it being there in a male-only society, we see this happening in the world of Wonder Woman. And it still has an ethics of care and immanence and womanhood to it. Even if we just took two of those nodes and zoomed in on them as if they were a binary, we're gonna miss how womanhood is just as much a transcendence as manhood, and manhood is just as much a immanence as womanhood. An ethics of care could be just as much applied in the realm of competition in that same anime sense of how the two main characters, in deeply caring for each other, want to see them surpass the selves that they're currently at, to transcend that self. So in that sense, an ethics of care could be transcendent and could promote transcendent qualities. And the other point I wanted to make coming back to this slide is that I don't think we should view immanence or transcendence as superior to one another, but both aspects of our humanity. All right. There's a sense in which more right-leaning groups believe that the left wants to erase manhood, and I don't think that's the case. Again, we want to recenter manhood on its good qualities, its qualities that promote the health and wealth of everyone else in society as well. And the reason that we're facing this recentering, this redefinition of manhood, is because we've seen a slippage of it back into the toxic masculinity with the reemergence of very misogynist takes. Obviously, Trump is an easy example. I think we can also find an example throughout the trial and the commentary of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. We also can see it in sayings, crazy sayings like your body, my choice, just insanely misogynist things that I feel like 20 years ago would have been confined to the niche internet chat rooms, but now can be spoken of in more common settings. And then I think an important aspect of this toxicity that we're seeing rise up is, alongside it, this concern for male loneliness. I'm not even going to call it an epidemic, because what it is, I think, is that men feel they have the right to a relationship with women, a right to it, not just a desire for it. And despite everything that's happening nowadays in the backpedaling of feminism, I think there's just too many women who see now the harms and insanity of patriarchy. And so they're not going to go along with being with a guy just because that's what society tells them to do, and they no longer are reliant on having to be with a guy. That's what this male loneliness is about, is men returning to this feeling of having the right to be with women and women dismissing that presumptiveness. And so I think the relationships that you see that succeed are the ones that, at least in heterosexual relationships, the ones where the man, and even in queer relationships, where the person who sees themselves as the man can come to it with equal footing and with mutual respect for the woman, which there's many nuances to that too. But so I kind of wanted to wrap all this up with a reflection on my life. I definitely grew up in a culture where I was raised to be a man, and what it meant to be a man were to have attributes such as toughness, to be seen or thought of as a protector, and to be a gentleman. And I don't think any of these aspects in and of themselves are bad. I do think it's interesting how we go from tough to protector to gentle man. I think you could maybe best characterize this in, gosh, what's his name? The new white male guy who's all over the movie circuit. His portrayal of the character in The Running Man, the recent adaptation of it. You can see a mostly non-problematic characterization of this tough protector and someone who's deferential to the women in his life to a certain extent, without coming across as patronizing or misogynist necessarily.
I will shoot us both if you start crying. Cry when it's over.
When will that be?
And part of what I felt was this separation from womanhood, because I was taught to be like a man because I am a man, or at least that's what I was told I was. And so there was this separation from women and, God dang it, and also from queerness, because I was told I am not those things. And those things are, on one end, queerness bad, or on the other end, womanhood different than what I am. And I think in that way, I was kind of failed to be brought up and not be able to be connected to my queerness or my womanhood. And I understand that that sounds weird. I think each of us, regardless of whether we are or describe ourselves, identify as men, can still have aspects of ourselves that are womanly, have aspects of ourselves that are queer, without necessarily fully taking on those identities in a social sphere. And I think that's actually good, because it allows for connection with those other communities. But yeah, and I think what that led to was an obscuring of what I wanted in my relationships with women, because I never got to explore. I did get to, more than most, I think, men who grew up in similar circumstances to me. I did get to explore some aspects of my queerness and womanhood in ways that were allowed, but there was this overwhelming voice that I felt spoken to me a lot of the times, that I should first and foremost be a man. And so the reason for all this is to say that I wish I had had a less traditional upbringing, one where women are tough and men can talk about their emotions.